unlike some other systems around the world, we direct seed all of our rice. So, with the drill, just like we would plant wheat or something like that, we're drilling it into the ground. And in Arkansas, that's 90% of the way we plant our rice is drill seeded. And we practice what we refer to as a direct seeded delayed flood system.
It's rice production in the Razorback State. This week on the AgNow Roundup. Well, howdy. Welcome to the AgNow Roundup. My name is Dave Deacon. It's a busy time of year for agriculture and especially the crop side of it all. And one of the busier crops has to be rice. This week on the AgNow Roundup, we're taking a look at the Arkansas rice crop with Dr. Jared Hardicke of the University of Arkansas Extension. We'll be talking with him in just a couple of minutes, but first let's take a look at the weather across the Ag Nation with meteorologist Matt Makins.
AgNow weather time just updated, at least when this video was recorded. We got the new information today for the drought monitor. Very few changes, some subtle differences, but overall still looking at primary concern areas, if you will, to be central and western Kansas, stretching down into Mexico. Parts of Texas here and New Mexico, the drought pretty exceptional already, and that area will be growing as we go throughout the next several weeks and several months ahead. To the north and northwest, we'll have to watch that area for potential drought development over the next month to 2 to 3 months throughout the summer, and that's obviously a prime hay and grass areas, so we'll watch out for that. As far as corn country, very little drought, technically speaking. Of course, brief periods of dry weather will start to move in as we're going to have a less frequent storm flow. More on that in a moment. As far as the drought is concerned, if you missed last week's AgNow weather report, the good thing about this drought footprint, yeah, we still have the drought. But if you look at that map in total and just give me the area that's covered in any form of drought, we can stretch that timeline out like this. And over here, where we are currently, is the lowest amount of drought we've had since April of 2020. So longer than 4 years to get to this point to beat down the drought. But it's going to reverse. La Nina's kicking in. We're going to have a dry outlook for a lot of months ahead. Here's a look at the hazards that may be coming your way. We'll kind of show you the whole summary first and then break it down. Most of the action is southern states, and that's a combination of wind and heat as well as rain, and we still have some ongoing flooding in some cases. Let's just look at wind and heat together, and that's covering the west, southwest, Four Corners region, southern plains. This wind area, wind and heat, you guess where drought's going in that region. Four Corners, Arizona, New Mexico, waiting with bated breath for the monsoon, which is going to be very weak this year anyway. We're going to be looking for drought numbers to increase there. Turning to where we have water, and there's going to be heavy rainfall from the 8th here to about the 9th and 10th, and it's going to stretch from basically Denver, go right over Wichita and Oklahoma City toward Memphis and out toward Nashville. And that area of heavy rainfall is going to be a number of thunderstorms. Could be severe problems with that, obviously, from a hail and wind standpoint, as well as tornadoes. And then these little spots up here in the upper Midwest, that's some pockets of some isolated flooding. Whenever it comes to the severe stuff, hail, tornadoes, damaging wind, that's a day-specific kind of forecast. So again, I'll steer you towards social media. You can follow me, Matt Makins, on all the channels that way, or Storm Prediction Center. It can give you a better heads up on the severity of storms that may be coming your way. But here's the timeline, and know that these clusters of thunderstorms that we see popping up on the map, all of them carry the possibility of being severe. It's that time of the year. But as we go from Saturday into Sunday and Monday and Tuesday, a number of thunderstorm complexes are going to be popping up here and pushing off to the east. As I cycle through these images, feel free to just grab that, the timeline guy down there, and you can pause at certain times or scroll ahead slowly and see how things evolve for you. On to the total moisture now. Some bullseyes of heavy rainfall. It's going to be kind of the, southern high plains, central areas of Flint Hills and Osage. We'll have quite a bit of rainfall moving back over Florida too. And then we have another kind of area of some valuable water, and that's going to be the Canadian prairies and the northern high plains. That area, still looking at less than an inch, but it's good water. As you look from Denver to Santa Fe, Dallas, Oklahoma City, up toward Omaha. I'll fly that map in, and you get some of the counties that have popped up on here. But you kind of look out towards Osage region, the Flint Hills here. We're going to have upwards of 2, maybe 3 or 4 inches, depending on the strength of the storms as they arrive. But just general kind of average estimate would be around 2 inches, if not a little bit less. For I-25 here around the Front Range, we're looking at least an inch of rain in many cases, valuable water, and that stretches out into the panhandles. Let's talk snow. Why not? I mean, I'm a snow lover. I like it, but my area, pretty dry. Just a little bit of snow in the Canadian Rockies and down into the Northern Rockies here. Valuable water resource. We're going to need that runoff as we go into the summer and fall. Very dry outlook as La Nina is kicking in. And not to go too far out, but let's talk about the weeks ahead. The next 4 weeks in chunks. So we have 6th of June to the 13th, 13th to the 20th, 20th to the 27th, and then here we get into July 4th. These are temperatures first. For this week, we've got the colder temperatures kind of moving off to the east. A lot of heat for the west. And then notice how the heat spreads out in the central U.S. for week number 2, week number 3. We're having warmer than normal temperatures across most of the country. And then week number 4 here, wrapping up June into early July, quite a bit of heat. And it stays around the American West and at times into the upper Midwest. In terms of precipitation throughout that time span, the moisture is going to favor week number 1, the area I showed you, the 2 bullseye kind of areas down from Colorado to Missouri. For week number 2, we'll have to watch out for potential tropical impacts here, tropical surges, tropical cyclones, those kind of things. Really not just week number 2, but all the way through the summer and fall. But that's going to be the most likely area for waters down across the Gulf Coast states, up into Canada and some of the northern high plains. Week number 3 here, looking at South Texas to be most favored, and week number 4, also South Texas to be most favored. But remember, Gulf Coast states, it's going to be are very likely to be a very active hurricane season as La Nina kicks in. The Gulf waters are very, very warm. That's good from a moisture standpoint if you're Gulf Coast states, but it could be too bad because you'd get too much water. But I digress on that. Anyway, those are your weekly chunks here as we go through June into early July. Until the next time, Matt Macon's here.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. And we'll certainly take all the rain we can get this time of year because we know here in a couple of weeks it'll stop and we won't see it again until September or October. That's just part of how it works, I guess. This week on the AgNow Roundup, we're taking a look at the rice crop in the United States, more specifically in Arkansas. Now, did you know that Arkansas produces the most rice in the United States? We're talking with the University of Arkansas Extension's Dr. Jared Hardicke about just that. Dr. Hardicke, thank you so much for going on with us today. And what makes Arkansas such a great place for rice production?
That's a very wide open question. So rice production in Arkansas is primarily in the eastern half of the state. We just kind of generally call, the eastern half of the state the Delta. It's not entirely all Delta, but we refer to it that way. For disclosure, there is actually some rice production in the Arkansas River Valley west of Little Rock, as well as the far southwestern corner of the state. Some rice production down there. So again, not exclusively the eastern half, but the bulk of it is certainly there. On an annual basis, we range anywhere from 1.1 million all the way up to 1.5 million acres of rice in a given year. We've certainly had more than those numbers, but that's kind of the average range we operate in for the past 10, 15 years, roughly, kind of the range that we're in. We grow both long grain rice and medium grain rice, predominantly long grain. So your typical table rice, that you consume, just cook on the stovetop, eat with your meals. Also, the medium grain that's used a lot more in the food industry to make things like your Rice Krispies or your other types of cereal bars, things like that. And also in the food service industry, it keeps better that way. So a lot of opportunities there and some slight differences from rice produced in, say California. So Arkansas is, again, 85-90% long grain, 10 to 15% medium grain, and the majority of the rest of the Mid-South outside of Arkansas, so Missouri, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, are all predominantly long grain as well, kind of operate that way. So we do cover a lot of acreage. It is a very important crop for the state of Arkansas. Really only soybean is grown on greater acres on an annual basis. So, soybeans more like 3 million acres. But after that, rice would come in second on the row crop side. We still classify rice as a row crop, even though it's not really the same way. But in the last roughly 8 years, believe it or not, we think of rice as a flood crop. We grow it in a flood, and we love that. We can get into that more in a second. But since I brought up the row crop part, in the last 8 years, we started growing more furrow irrigated rice. So we do have some true row crop rice, and really about 15 to 20% of our rice acres now are grown as furrow irrigated, believe it or not.
That's amazing. What makes Arkansas such a great state for rice?
So, interestingly enough, a lot of the soils in, again, what we're referring to as the Delta are silt loam soils with a clay base underneath. So we have kind of a natural hard pan underneath that's excellent for holding water. And outside of those, as we transition closer to the Mississippi River into what you can call the true Delta area, it turns into very heavy clay soils. Again, excellent for holding water and moisture. So our ability to grow, again, our traditionally flooded rice crop has just set up extremely well. The temperatures that we experience throughout the summer, now there's always extremes that eventually something doesn't like, but for the most part, as we get into the low to mid 90s for our typical averages during the summer and everything, that's a very good temperature range for rice, being upper 60s to low 70s at night, upper 80s to low to mid 90s during the day. Really been very, very good for what is primarily rice, a temperate type crop. And so it's found great success, and certainly we have a lot of available natural resources from streams, rivers, underground water, everything like that to provide adequate irrigation for the crop as well. So a lot of things that really just kind of came together starting 120 years ago.
Wow.
to begin the rice industry in the state of Arkansas.
Whenever you flood a crop, what is the importance of doing that, and how often do you rotate the water? Does that water stay in that same paddy until the end of the season?
So the flooding of the rice crop is a particularly interesting topic that I frequently find when discussing with those, not ingrained in the industry,
right?
That there's a lot of misconception about how and why and what goes into that. So one of the first things to remember is that rice is a flood tolerant crop. We use the flood to our advantage because it will tolerate it. You don't have to have a flood, which brings us to the furrow irrigated or row rice comment that we can grow it without a flood. So unlike some other systems around the world, we direct seed all of our rice. So, with the drill, just like we would plant wheat or something like that, we're drilling it into the ground. And in Arkansas, that's 90% of the way we plant our rice is drill seeded. And we practice what we refer to as a direct seeded delayed flood system. So we're drilling that rice. The remainder is going to be broadcast, with some type of spreader. Again, other grass crops and things done similarly, and then scratched in with some type of cultivator. Lots of different kinds of those, but some type. And again, allowed to come up. And we're going to wait all the way until rice gets to the 5th leaf stage or beyond before we actually do finally put out our primary nitrogen fertilizer application and apply a flood to those fields. So we're not flooding from the very beginning of that season. We're waiting until, again, depending on when we plant, which another relevant topic, I can touch on that in a minute, but as we move through the season, that's when we go to flood. And again, we have levees constructed to help us control and maintain flood depth as we, have gradients to our slopes and manage those through. And the goal, certainly from the time we initiate the flood, is there's no such thing as a static flood through plant water use. Again, you hold water really well in our soils, but there's always some leaching and then evaporation in play. We're going to have an ebb and flow of that flood depth, but our goal is to largely keep the field mostly flooded to well irrigated, we'll put it that way, throughout the season until we get close to harvest, when we then drain the water off, get the field dried up so that we can get combine harvest equipment in there and actually harvest the crop. So one of the big reasons that we do flood, I know I already mentioned rice tolerates it. Okay, that's great, right? But why? So the two big reasons, and the long-standing joke is, we flood rice, depending on who you ask, will tell you what's most important. So my answer is there's a 1A and a 1B to why we flood rice. One is for fertility, or 1A is for fertility, 1B is for weed control. And so if you ask a fertility person, they're going to say it's for the fertility, for nitrogen management, and the weed science is going to tell you we do it so we can control weeds. So the direct seeded delayed flood system is one of the, if not the most nitrogen efficient ways to grow rice in the world, because we apply our nitrogen, typically as urea, to a dry soil surface. And then when we put that flood on the field, we incorporate that nitrogen approximately 4 inches deep. And as long as we keep that soil flooded to saturated, then that nitrogen is not going anywhere. So it's going to stay there and remain very stable for the rice crop to take it up, and we get to move along. So that, preventing that loss and maximizing efficiency. But from the weed control standpoint, as a general rule of thumb, talking to anybody that deals with weed control at all, but certainly in rice, again, because this comment, a weed will come up through a plant. Sorry, let's just say that a plant will come up through soil, or it will come up through water, but it won't come up through both. So essentially, once you get, for most of our primary weeds, like in rice, barnyard grass and weedy rice, and some of our sedges would be our primary weeds of concern. There we're trying to get out residual herbicides, things like that, to keep them from coming up. But once we get a flood on top of it, those are germinating and trying to emerge from below the soil. They're not coming up at that point, certainly. But if you have seed that's at the soil surface, they don't really have to come through the soil. So some of your aquatic species certainly do come up in the flood, but those are still surprisingly minimal in the majority of our rice crop. But that's why we actually, when I make the soil and water comment about what will come up, rice is a great example, because we can water seed rice. We can just fly rice seed into a standing flood, and it will germinate, root down into the soil, and pop up and put a shoot out, and we can grow it that way if we choose. In certain areas of the Mid-South, certainly where Arkansas is, we do practice that on a limited basis. But for example, California, that's predominantly the way that they grow rice, is water seeding. They're 90-95% water seeded. So lots of opportunity there. But that's kind of the hows and whys that we do flood rice, and the reason we maintain it. If you flip to the furrow irrigated situation, again, we have to avoid water stress. Certainly, it is, I guess I should add that in there on the flood part. Again, rice is flood tolerant. It is fairly shallow rooted, so it is a little more susceptible to drought stress than our other traditional row crops. So again, an additional kind of reason B, we covered 1A and 1B. Let's go to, I guess, to reason 2 now. What would be, well, with it flooded, there's not much chance of that drought stress happening.
Right.
When we move to furrow irrigated, we have to be really, really mindful of being timely with our irrigation to avoid that drought stress without any type of flood in place.
Whenever you do the furrow planting, the drilling it in as it is, what kind of row spacing do you do with that? And have you tried different spacing for different types of weed control?
Yes, we actually have. So one of the things we found that's actually fairly simple and straightforward is that the furrow, well, I'll try to get the terminology where it's as clear as mud. Our furrow spacing for those beds, for our rows that way, it's really worked out well to mimic what we're doing for our other crops in certain areas of the state. So as an example, on our lighter soils that have a silt loam upper layer, we do a predominantly 30-inch furrow spacing. So if we're growing soybeans, we're planting single row with 30-inch furrow, 30-inch middle to middle for furrows. And as we move to our heavier clay soils, you typically move to more like a 38-inch furrow spacing, and in some cases a little bit wider. Some are moving to more like 60-inch on that. So that's getting a little wide on the rice side. I'll get to that. But essentially, we're taking our same drill equipment that we're using when we're drilling flat and then going to build levees and flood rice using the same equipment. But we're just worried about our furrow spacing for ensuring we can get adequate irrigation and wick water across those beds to get moisture to all of the rice every time that we irrigate. That's one of the biggest issues in it, in not wanting to get too wide. So on some of our loamier soils where they have attempted some wider furrow spacings, 36, 38, 40-inch spacing, water doesn't always want to get to the center of those beds in there, and we see some yield decline and impacts on the center of the bed. By the same token, as you move to the heavier clay soils, they're much better on really, really wide spacings, but at some point getting out there, typically closer to that 60-inch, you can see an effect in the very middle of those getting a little restrictive, and at times, if it gets too dry, impacting some yield. One bigger restriction is later in the season when that rice gets really large. The rice that's out toward the edges closest to the furrow where the water is, they're taking up a lot of water before that water can seep and infiltrate into the center of the bed where the other rice is, and you see those limitations. So that's been a learning curve. But even you mentioned on the weed control side, so within the last few years, one of my weed science counterparts who actually departed for another opportunity just in the last year, but worked on a grant where we went in and looked at a combination of, I've been focused on the furrow spacing, a little less focus on the furrow spacing and more on the drill row unit spacing that we use to actually space the rice plants themselves, looking at that aspect in combination with seeding rates and some different cultivars and what that impact was. Didn't look too earth-shattering in that, saying that, the wider we spread those rice drill rows apart, the more problems we began to have. Especially as we got particularly wide, kind of stretching those limitations a little bit. So still more work to be done on that front. But I guess to that point, the majority of our rice is drilled on, the drill rows are on 7.5-inch spacing. Very common spacing out there across a lot of grass crops, and it works very well for rice. We've revisited that spacing in recent years, and it continues to support that anywhere from 3 to 4, as narrow as 3 to 4 inches, all the way up to about 10 inches apart for drill rows is still very, very effective. Certainly going any wider than that, we start to see inconsistencies. It's getting a little too wide for the rice crop to adequately and consistently compensate for that distance apart.
I use row spacing in wheat as kind of a guide for me, because where I am in the southern Great Plains, 3 to 4 inches sounds awful darn close for rows of any grass crop.
Yes, it is extremely close, and I'm not advising that we, for any reason, go to that scale. We just know that the yield potential is still there. I have some pretty extreme concerns from a lodging potential standpoint with that much rice being that close together. So I'm not advocating for that narrow, but the data said it's fine if you want to do it. But you're certainly going to have some other things to worry about.
Well, speaking of other things to worry about, this is kind of a time of year where rice producers are scouting for different pests, be it weed, but also insect pressures. What are we seeing in rice this time of year, and what can producers do to prevent it? But then also, what's coming down the pipe for that?
Sure. So in this early part of the season, as we start and we're trying to get a lot of rice fertilized and put to flood right now. And in this particular season, it's maybe the biggest trial to accomplish that in recent years, because we can't get consistently dry conditions really for about the past 5-6 weeks. So again, I mentioned earlier that focus on fertilizing dry soil so that we can incorporate the urea. That's been it's been something for a while now, but we're trying. But on that early season comment, so rice is unique in some ways in that we have a couple of different soil-borne insect pests that are little complicated to deal with, and one in particular that it's not as widespread, but can be particularly devastating is grape calaspis, which again, it's a grub. It's the grub form that's in the soil that'll just sit there and eat the roots off of a young rice plant all the way until it kills it, essentially. Kills the rice plant. So we do use a significant amount of seed treatments in rice, both fungicide and insecticide. When I say significant amount, to cover our spectrum of things we have to worry about, not total amount of actual product, just using a suite of products. So we have a few different fungicides on to protect us from things such as Pythium and Rhizoctonia that are seedling diseases that, again, we grow rice in a situation where soils that hold moisture well, because we want to flood and have adequate well, that also makes them a little partial to seedling diseases of that nature when early season is wetter. So that protection is there, and then the insecticide is there, again, starting with grape calaspis to prevent that early season feeding. Once we get a little further along and the rice is off and running, it can outgrow a lot of that damage, but the small seedling and small root system can't take a lot of damage at that point. As we move toward the fertilizing and flood timing, and we have a decent number of acres that have now gone to flood and even have been flooded for a while, rice water weevil. That's more of an in season. So those adults come in, feed on the leaves of rice, and they crawl down into the flood, down to the soil line, and oviposit, and those eggs hatch out. And I mentioned grape calaspis as a grub. Well, they're more sporadic and a little larger. Well, these are small grubs from these water weevils, and they begin to feed on rice roots, but typically in a much greater density when they occur. When we're on time and the crop is staying on time, we continue to get some activity to shut those down from our seed treatment. When things get really delayed and strung out, and that insecticide begins to dissipate, we get less and less control of water weevils. So we're having to do some additional foliar insecticide sprays to shut down those adults coming in and laying eggs and starting this problem that can lead to eventual yield loss as we kind of move forward from here. Those are the two big early season ones. At this point, rice, again, can be host to a lot of things. They're typically more sporadic early season, such as armyworm issues coming in to defoliate rice and take it out. Again, just like with wheat. When Arkansas used to grow a lot more wheat, which 20 years ago, don't hold me to these numbers as being exact, I'm ballparking, but 20 years ago or so, Arkansas grew 1 million acres of wheat.
Wow.
We grow like 150,000 acres now.
Wow.
So, yeah, big difference. So in the spring, it was not uncommon that as wheat was maturing, you would get armyworms marching out of maturing wheat headed for rice fields. And we have to combat them more often. So we don't combat them a lot. They're still a problem, just a little more sporadically. We had some cutworm issues even this year, going through getting in rice and clipping them off. Chinch bugs are another fun one that show up really, really sporadically, cause some damage and injury, and can be a pain. But those types, again, are very, very limited. We're starting to enter what we term mid-season for rice. Rice is fun to talk growth stages because there's a lot of jargon to it. But we have some more official terminology, don't get me wrong, but the most commonly used remarks about it are very, very jargon-based. So mid-season is typically once we've fertilized and flooded rice, after 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the cultivar, we go from where we've been in vegetative growth and start to enter reproductive growth. And that's that mid-season term. That's really what that's referring to, is that shift into reproductive growth, and what will be the eventual panicle or head on the crop begins to move up out of the crown of the plant below ground and begins to form that head at that time. So when we see that shift into reproductive growth, that's when there's a big physiological change in the plant, obviously, going vegetative reproductive, but there's a big shift in the nutrient balance in the plant as well. And when that shift happens, not uncommon at all, we get an imbalance, particularly in potassium, which, not a shock to most, potassium is majorly responsible for helping us prevent disease issues. Well, you get this shift in potassium, potash, And that's typically when the door gets opened a little bit, not necessarily wide open, but there's a wrinkle in there if there's any pressure to get a few disease things started. Not that they're going to maintain or turn out that bad, but so we're there. So we're starting to see for us sheath blight, which is Rhizoctonia solani, that common across a lot of crops. Arrow web blight and bean, same thing. And so we're seeing a little bit of that, and then we don't grow a lot of blast susceptible cultivars, but rice blast can be particularly devastating. Well, we're already picking up some leaf blast at this timing. The leaf blast part's not that concerning. We have to watch it. We know it's present. Blast is particularly concerning because it wants to infect the neck and head of that panicle and lead to direct yield loss that way. The leaf infection, as long as it doesn't get severe, is not that concerning. But those would be two of the main ones of concern. That and we do have some smut issues in rice that infect the grain, both kernel smut and fall smut. And when we do, I have to do some smart fungicide work to try to prevent those in certain areas that are a little bit more prone to those diseases. But that's really kind of a springboard for us right now. Typically, as we shift gears, most of our disease issues start now, or at least start having to be monitored now as we enter mid-season. And with the conditions we've had, if we continue with the mild temperatures and frequent rainfall, there's no doubt it will be a disease year.
That's pretty cool. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hardicke, for going on with us and talking with us about the rice that's grown in Arkansas and how producers are able to get the most out of it. We do appreciate it.
Yes, wonderful to be here and always happy to talk rice.
And of course, we want to thank you for watching this episode of the AgNow Roundup. If there's something on the show that you'd like to learn more about, say rice production in Arkansas or California, you can find more information about it on our website, agnowtv.com. And while you're there, sign up for our social media, our email account, or you can even download the AgNow TV app. It's all available at agnowtv.com. We're rooted in research and proven for producers. I'm Dave Deacon for AgNow.